So what are the political consequences of stagflation? Well, they're very important because, as I mentioned, the 1970s become the decade that sets the paradigm. It says what the problems are and what the answers are. Now, because the Keynesian consensus, because that Keynesian recipe had failed to deal adequately with inflation and high interest rates, with inflation and recession at the same time, the way is opened for those who want to argue that what we need is a more laissez-faire government, which cuts taxes, eliminates regulation, and lowers social spending. The way is open for them to make that argument and to get a ready reception among a much broader audience than they would have been able to get in the 1950s and 1960s when people still believed in a different paradigm, different set of problems, different set of answers. And along with that new recipe come other things as well, other things which also helped to answer some of the problems that have been troubling many Americans since the 1960s. The problem, for instance, of why their society seemed to be changing so much, why their culture seemed so disrupted, why violence seemed to be on the increase. And there are many causes for all of these problems, and some of them were over-reported to such an extent by the media that Americans really didn't have a clear picture of what was actually happening. But for those who were offering the new laissez-faire paradigm, there was often a kind of extra bonus in suggesting that what was seen as a sort of profligacy of deficit spending was somehow responsible for these other kinds of what they saw as profligacy, these other kinds of social and cultural breakdown, for unwed mothers and single-parent homes. For all of these kinds of social ills, it was suggested a shift to a new philosophy of how you direct capitalism from the top was the answer. Those political consequences had all kinds of other consequences as well, consequences that played out in the social and economic life of millions of ordinary Americans. The declining protection for individual workers, for the labor movement, and in particular, the rollback of regulations on the financial sector in the United States would help to drive a tremendous shift in the American economy. And there are all kinds of ways in which this played out. The deindustrialization of large sectors of the American Northeast and Midwest, in particular, the offshoring of numerous industries, the rise in competing products, which wipes out still other industries. But maybe the single biggest thing, maybe the single biggest transformation is the increasingly powerful role of the financial sector, of Wall Street and other markets, other associated exchange and stock exchange and bond markets in the U.S. economy itself. And we can look at that shift in a couple of different ways. We can look at the rise and the percentage of the American GDP that is accounted for by the financial sector, and we've got great graphs of that. Or we could also look at the rise in the income of those who disproportionately benefit from the financialization of American society. And this is in particular the top 1% of all income earners. Now what we see is that over the years since the start of the New Deal, the percentage of all American income that they had earned in a given year had been in decline. But starting around 1975 or so, and especially taking off after 1980, that percentage begins to accelerate. It accelerates from less than 10% to well over 20%. Slows down in the 1990s, takes off again in the 2000s until it nearly hits 30%. That transformation is a tremendous shift in income and ultimately in wealth, away from the lower 90% in particular of American income earners. That, in turn, will have all kinds of effects in the lives of that 90%. And many of these effects are very destabilizing. Many of these effects are what are going to, in fact, push them into credit markets, into borrowing increasing amounts of money to sustain a lifestyle that is even like that, not even increased from that of the 1970s, but is even on par with that. And in particular, we're going to see that some of those choices that they make aren't even what we would call lifestyle choices. Those are simply what have to be defined, I think, as necessities. Medical care which gets increasingly costly and for which people increasingly borrow money, and education for their children, especially higher education, which becomes more and more expensive relative to their incomes.